In the ruthless underworld of Seoul, legendary Mafia boss Kang Jae-Hyun built his empire on one unbreakable rule: trust no one. Feared by allies and enemies alike, he survives through cold calculation and merciless loyalty to the syndicate that forged him into a weapon. But when a violent coup leaves him wounded and hunted through rain-soaked neon streets, his world begins to collapse. While hiding in a deserted alleyway, Jae-Hyun encounters Ha-eun, a 6-year-old girl clutching a worn teddy bear. Instead of running from the dangerous stranger, she approaches him with quiet familiarity and whispers a secret that shatters everything he believed about his past. She is the daughter of the only man Jae-Hyun ever loved like a brother, a man he thought he had killed years ago to prove his loyalty. As rival gangs and police close in, the feared mafia boss is forced into an impossible choice: reclaim his throne through violence or protect the child who represents his greatest sin, and his last chance at redemption. Over 48 relentless hours across a city determined to erase him, Jae-Hyun discovers that the weakness he feared most may be the only thing capable of saving his soul. Because sometimes, the most dangerous men are undone not by enemies, but by innocence. The rain continued to pour, turning the neon lights of the city into blurry streaks of red and blue. On the wet pavement, Jae-Hyun sat against the cold bricks of the alley, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He pressed a hand against his side, trying to stop the dark stain spreading across his white shirt. On the other hand, his silver pistol felt heavy, a cold reminder of the life he had chosen. He closed his eyes, waiting for the end. He had spent his whole life trusting no one, and now, he was dying alone. But the sound of splashing footsteps didn't bring a hitman. Instead, a small shadow fell over him. Jae-Hyun snapped his eyes open, his finger tightening on the trigger. Standing there was a little girl no older than 6. She wore a bright yellow raincoat that looked much too big for her small frame. She wasn't screaming. She wasn't even afraid. She just stood there, clutching a worn-out teddy bear to her chest. "You shouldn't be here," Jae-Hyun growled, his voice cracking like dry wood. "Run away. Now." The girl didn't move. Her lower lip trembled slightly, and her eyes were red from crying, but she stepped closer. She reached into the pocket of her oversized coat and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. With small, shaking hands, she smoothed it out and held it up for him to see. It was a drawing. It was simple, done in bright pencils, but the face on the paper made Jae-Hyun's heart stop. He was a man with a kind smile and a small mole under his left eye. It was Minho, the only man Jae-Hyun had ever called a brother. The man he thought had vanished into the shadows of the underworld years ago after a job went wrong. "My daddy told me you would come," the girl whispered. Her voice was tiny, nearly drowned out by the thunder above. Jae-Hyun felt a cold shiver that had nothing to do with the rain. Who is your daddy?" The girl leaned in, her damp hair brushing against her scarred cheek. She smelled like soap and old rain. She put her small hand over her blood-stained fingers and leaned toward his ear. "He said to tell the man with sad eyes that the debt is paid," she whispered. "He said you were finally coming to take me home." Jae-Hyun's hand dropped, the heavy gun clattering into a puddle. For 20 years, he had built a wall around his heart that no bullet could pierce. But with those few words, the wall didn't just crack, it shattered. He looked at the girl, really looked at her, and saw Minho's eyes staring back at him. "Ha-eun," he breathed, her name tasting like a prayer he hadn't said in a lifetime. She nodded slowly, a single tear rolling down her cheek. "I've been waiting a long time." Ajushi. Jae-Hyun realized then that he couldn't die in this alley. He had a reason to stand up. The moment of silence was shattered by the harsh screech of tires at the end of the alley. Bright headlights cut through the rain, turning the falling water into silver needles. Jae-Hyun's instincts, honed by years of war, snapped back into place. He knew that sound. It was a black sedan. The Black Serpent gang had found him. "Stay behind me," Jae-Hyun hissed. His voice was no longer weak, he was the cold command of a boss. He grabbed Ha-eun's small shoulder and pulled her into the dark space between his back and the brick wall. He opened his heavy, soaked suit jacket, wrapping the dark fabric around her like a protective wing. Ha-eun didn't fight him. She huddled close, her small hands clutching the back of his shirt, her face pressed against his spine. He could feel his heart beating fast, like a trapped bird. Two men stepped out of the car. They held long metal pipes and sharp knives that glinted in the neon light. They walked slowly, splashing through the deep puddles, their faces twisted into cruel smiles. "Found you, Kang Jae-Hyun," the leader mocked, his voice echoing off the narrow walls. "The great tiger is finally cornered. Just give us your head, and maybe we'll make it quick." Jae-Hyun felt the weight of the gun in his hand. He knew exactly what to do. He could pull the trigger twice, and the threat would be gone in seconds. It was what he had done 100 times before. But as he tightened his grip, he felt a small sob shake Ha-eun's tiny frame behind him. He froze. If he fired now, the flash would blind her. The sound would deafen her. The blood would stain her yellow coat forever. For the first time in his life, the Mafia boss was afraid of his own violence. He couldn't let this innocent girl see the monster he had become. "Close your eyes, Ha-eun," he whispered over his shoulder, his voice surprisingly soft. "Cover your ears. Don't listen, no matter what." "I'm scared," she whimpered into his back. "I know," Jae-Hyun said, his eyes turning into chips of ice as he looked at the men approaching. "But I promised your father. I'm taking you home." Jae-Hyun didn't raise his gun. Instead, he tucked it into his waistband. If he couldn't shoot, he would have to use his hands. He stepped forward, keeping his body positioned like a shield in front of the girl. He had to finish this silently. He had to be her hero, even if his hands were already stained red. The rain didn't stop until they reached a crumbling apartment building on the edge of the city. This was a place Jae-Hyun kept for emergencies, a ghost apartment that didn't exist on any map. He leaned heavily against the door as it clicked shut, finally safe from the men in the alley. The room was cold and smelled like dust, but it was dry. Jae-Hyun stumbled to a wooden chair and sank into it. The adrenaline was fading, and the pain in his side felt like a hot iron. He looked over at Ha-eun, who was standing by the door, dripping wet. He realized he needed to set some rules. He needed to be the boss again so she would stay safe. "Listen to me," he said, trying to make his face look like stone. "This isn't a game. You sit in that corner. You don't touch anything. I am a dangerous man, and..." He stopped when he saw Ha-eun wasn't looking at his scary expression. She was staring at his side. Without a word, she walked over to her small, wet backpack. She pulled out a plastic box, decorated with bright pink sparkles. "You're hurting," she said simply. Jae-Hyun tried to pull away as she approached. "I told you to stay back. I can take care of myself." "My daddy said heroes always get hurt," Ha-eun whispered. She reached into her box and pulled out a handful of bandages. They weren't the medical kind he was used to. They were covered in bright yellow ducks and blue space aliens. Before the most feared man in Incheon could protest, the little girl knelt by his side. Her small, cold fingers were incredibly gentle as she peeled back the blood-soaked fabric of his shirt. Jae-Hyun winced, his breath catching in his throat, but he didn't move. He watched in stunned silence as she carefully placed a space alien bandage over a deep cut on his arm. Then, she added a yellow duck bandage near the wound on her side. "There," she said, patting the bandage gently. The ducks make the pain go away faster. Jae-Hyun looked down at his arm. He was a man who wore suits that cost thousands of dollars. He was a man people trembled to speak to. And yet, here he was, covered in cartoon stickers. Applied by a child who wasn't even afraid of him. His mask of the boss began to slip. He looked at her messy hair and her tired eyes, and for the first time in years, he felt a strange warmth in his chest. It wasn't the heat of anger or the sting of a wound. It was something else, something he hadn't felt since he was a boy. "Thank you, Hyun," he muttered, his voice losing its sharp edge. She gave him a small, shy smile and hugged her teddy bear. Jae-Hyun realized then that while he was supposed to be the one saving her, she was the one currently stitching his broken soul back together. The cold apartment felt a little warmer as Hyun sat on the floor, tucked into a blanket. Jae-Hyun had found in a dusty closet. He watched her carefully, his side still throbbing under the yellow duck bandages. To the rest of the world, he was a monster, but to this little girl, he was just a man with sad eyes who needed stickers. "Tell me about your father," Jae-Hyun said softly. He was afraid of the answer, but he had to. "No. Tell me about Minho." Hyun's face reads up at the mention of the name. "Daddy is the best," she said, hugging her teddy bear. "He told me stories about a brave tiger he used to know. He said the tiger was very strong but forgot how to smile. I think he was talking about you." Jae-Hyun felt a lump in his throat. 20 years ago, the Mafia elders had told him that Minho was a traitor. They had ordered Jae-Hyun to get rid of him to prove his loyalty. On that dark night, Jae-Hyun couldn't bring himself to do it. He had fired his gun into the water and told Minho to run and never look back. He had spent 2 decades believing his friend had died. Anyway, lost to the cold sea or the cruel streets. He lived in a small house by the mountains, Hyun continued, her voice dreamy. He walked with a limp, and his arm didn't work very well, but he always made me breakfast. He told me that one day, his best friend would come to help us. He said his friend had a hard heart because the world was mean to him, but that he was a good man inside. Jae-Hyun closed his eyes, his chest tightening. Minho had survived. He had lived all these years with the injuries from that night, raising a daughter in secret, and he had never stopped believing in Jae-Hyun. Even though Jae-Hyun was the reason he had to live in hiding, Minho hadn't taught his daughter to hate him. He had taught her to wait for him. "Where is he now, Hyun?" Jae-Hyun asked, his voice barely a whisper. The girl's smile faded, and her eyes filled with tears. "Bad men came to our house. Daddy told me to run to the city and find the man in the drawing. He told me to wait in the alley where the blue lights are. He said he had to go away for a while to lead the bad men away." Jae-Hyun realized the truth. Minho hadn't disappeared because he was a coward, he had disappeared to save his daughter. And he had sent her to the only person he still trusted, the man who was supposed to have killed him. Jae-Hyun looked at the drawing of Minho again. The debt wasn't paid. It was just beginning. He reached out and awkwardly patted Hyun's head. "I'll find him, Hyun. I promise." The sun began to peek through the cracked window of the safe house, but it didn't bring any comfort to Jae-Hyun. He stood by the glass, peering through a small gap in the curtains. Down on the street, a black car drove by slowly. Then another. The city was crawling with men looking for him, and for the first time in his life, Jae-Hyun felt a cold, shaking fear deep in his bones. In the past, fear was simple. He was afraid of losing his power or losing his life. But as he looked back at the small bed where Hyun lay sleeping, clutching her teddy bear, the fear felt different. It was heavy and sharp. He realized that if he made one mistake, he wouldn't be the only one to pay for it. If a bullet found him, who would shield her? If the police took him away, who would hold her hand when she was scared of the thunder? He had spent years thinking he was brave because he didn't care if he lived or died. Now, he desperately wanted to live, and that made him feel weaker than he had ever been. He sat back down in the shadows, his hand remaining near his gun. He watched the way Haun's chest rose and fell as she dreamed. She looked so tiny in the big, dusty room. She was a weakness, the kind of thing his Mafia teachers had warned him about for decades. They said love was a trap that made a man easy to kill. They were right, he whispered to the empty room. I'm terrified. Every floorboard that creaked made him jump. Every distant siren made his heart race. He wasn't afraid of the pain of dying, he was afraid of the look in Haun's eyes if he failed her. He was afraid of her being left alone in a world full of monsters like him. Suddenly, Haun stirred in her sleep. She reached out her hand, searching for something in the dark, and her fingers brushed against Jae-Hyun's knee. Even in her sleep, she was looking for him. She trusted him completely, even though he was a man who had done terrible things. Jae-Hyun reached down and gently tucked the blanket around her shoulders. His hands, which were usually steady as stone when holding a weapon, were trembling. He realized that being a boss was easy. All you needed was a gun and a loud voice. But being a protector? That was the hardest job in the world. He looked out the window one more time, his jaw set tight. He would have to be smarter, faster, and better than he had ever been. Not for his throne, but for the little girl who thought he was a hero. The peace of the morning was shattered by a sharp, rhythmic knocking on the apartment door. It wasn't the heavy kick of a SWAT team, but a specific code Jae-Hyun knew well. He stood up. Instantly, his body shielding Haun's sleeping form. He pulled his gun and moved to the door, peering through the small eye-hole. Standing in the hallway was Sang-dae, his second-in-command and the man he had trusted to lead his soldiers for 10 years. Jae-Hyun lowered his weapon slightly and opened the door just a crack. Sang-dae slipped inside, his expensive suit looking out of place in the dusty room. He didn't look like a man coming to save his boss, he looked like a man coming to collect a debt. You look terrible, boss, Sang-dae said, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on the small girl waking up on the bed. A cold, greedy smile spread across his face. So, the rumors were true. You've been hiding a little ghost. Why are you here, Sang-dae? Jae-Hyun asked, his voice low and dangerous. The black serpents are burning the city down to find you, Sang-dae replied, stepping closer. Our business is dying. The men are scared. But they gave me a message. They don't want you anymore. They want her. They know she's the daughter of the man who stole their ledgers years ago. They think she knows where the money is hidden. Jae-Hyun felt a surge of cold anger. She's a child. She knows nothing. It doesn't matter what she knows, Sang-dae shrugged, as if he were talking about a piece of luggage. If we give her to them, the war ends. You can have your throne back. You can be the king of Incheon again. All you have to do is hand over the girl and walk away. It's a small price. For an empire, don't you think? Haun had sat up by now, rubbing her eyes. She looked from Jae-Hyun to the strange man, her face pale with confusion. She didn't understand the words, but she could feel the darkness in the room. She reached out for her teddy bear and whimpered. Jae-Hyun looked at Sang-dae, the man who had been his right hand for a decade. Then he looked at Haun, the girl who had covered his wounds with duck bandages. The throne felt like a pile of trash compared to the small life behind him. The empire is already gone, Sang-dae, Jae-Hyun said, his voice as steady as a heartbeat. And you have 5 seconds to leave this room before I show you exactly what happens to people who threaten my family. Sang-dae's smile vanished. He realized that the boss he knew, the man who valued power above all else, was gone. You're choosing a brat over your own life? You've gone soft. Jae-hyun. The men won't follow a man who's gone weak for a child. Then let them watch, Jae-hyun replied, raising his gun. Get out. As Sang-dae backed out of the door, his eyes promised that he would be back with more men. Jae-hyun locked the door, but he knew the safe house was no longer safe. He turned to Ha-eun, who was trembling. He didn't look like a boss anymore, he looked like a man who was ready to burn the whole world down to keep her safe. Jae-hyun didn't waste a single second. He knew that as soon as Sang-dae reached the street, the apartment building would become a cage. He grabbed his heavy black coat and draped it over Ha-eun's shoulders. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with fear, but she didn't say a word. She trusted him, and that trust felt heavier than any weapon he had ever carried. Stay close to me, Jae-hyun whispered. We are going to run, and we are not going to stop. No matter what you hear, keep your eyes on my back. They stepped out into the dim hallway. The air felt thick and cold. As they reached the top of the concrete stairs, the heavy thud of boots echoed from below. His own men, the soldiers he had trained and led, were coming up the stairs. They weren't coming to rescue him. They were coming for the girl. Jae-hyun pushed Ha-eun into the shadows of a small closet in the hallway. Stay here until I call you, he commanded. He stepped into the middle of the hallway just as the first 3 men reached the landing. They stopped when they saw him. These were men who had toasted to his health just a week ago. Now, they held weapons pointed at his heart. Move aside, boss, one of them said, his voice shaking. Sang-dae said you've lost your mind. Just give us the girl, and you can walk away. Jae-hyun didn't move. He stood tall, his scarred face illuminated by a flickering light bulb. You call me boss, but you forgot what that means. A leader protects his own. Today, she is mine. That means none of you are allowed to touch her. The men charged. Jae-hyun didn't want to kill the men he once called brothers, but he had a different kind of strength now. He fought with a desperate fury. He used his hands and his feet, striking with the power of a man who had everything to lose. He knocked the weapons away and felt the men crashing into the walls. He was a whirlwind of movement, taking hits but never falling. He was a human shield, blocking the path to the closet with every ounce of his strength. The hallway was filled with the sounds of shouting and the crash of breaking wood. Jae-hyun's side screamed in pain, and his old wounds reopened, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Finally, the men retreated down the stairs, realizing that the great tiger was even more dangerous now. That he had something to love. Jae-hyun leaned against the wall, breathing hard. He was covered in new bruises and blood, but the path was clear. He opened the closet door and reached out his hand. Ha-eun was shaking, her little hands over her ears, but when she saw his hand, she took it immediately. It's okay, he wheezed, giving her a small, bloody smile. The way is open. Let's go. They ran down the back fire escape, leaving his old life and his empire behind in the dust. Jae-hyun knew there was no going back now. He had burned every bridge he ever built, and for the first time, he felt truly free. The salty air of the Incheon harbor felt cold and sharp as Jae-hyun and Ha-eun reached the edge of the pier. The giant metal shipping containers looked like mountains in the dark, and the black water of the sea lapped against the wooden posts. Far off in the distance, the lights of a small boat flickered. That boat was their only way out, a chance to disappear forever. Jae-hyun stumbled, his legs finally giving out. He sat down on a rusted metal crate, his breath coming in ragged whistles. He was covered in dirt and blood, and his expensive suit was torn to rags. He looked at his hands and saw they were shaking. He had fought off his own men and walked through a nightmare to get here. He felt like a hollow shell of a man. Ha-eun stood beside him, still clutching her teddy bear. She looked at the dark water and then back at Jae-Hyun. She could see the pain in his eyes, not just the pain from his wounds, but a deeper sadness that had been there for 20 years. "We made it, Ha-eun," Jae-Hyun whispered, leaning his head against the cold metal. "The boat will be here soon. You'll be safe." Ha-eun stepped closer and tugged on his sleeve. "Ajushi," she said gently. "There is one more thing. Daddy told me a secret to tell you when we saw the ocean." Jae-Hyun looked up, his heart pounding. He thought about that night 20 years ago on a pier. Just like this one, when he had pointed a gun at his best friend and told him to run. He had lived every day since then wondering if Minho hated him. He had lived with the guilt of being a traitor to his friend and a monster to the world. The little girl leaned in, just like she had in the rainy alleyway. She placed her small, warm hand on her forehead, brushing away a strand of damp hair. "Daddy said he knew how hard it was for you that night," she whispered into his ear. "He said he knew you saved him. He told me to tell you. He forgave you before he left. He said you don't have to be a sad tiger anymore." The words hit Jae-Hyun harder than any bullet ever could. The heavy weight he had carried in his chest for 2 decades, the guilt, the shame, the loneliness, suddenly snapped. His breath hitched, and a sob broke out of his throat. He tried to hide his face in his hands, but the tears wouldn't stop. For the first time since he was a little boy, the great Mafia boss cried. He wept for the years he had lost, for the friend he had missed, and for the man he used to be. Ha-eun didn't turn away. She wrapped her small arms around her neck and held on tight, her teddy bear squished between them. "It's okay," she whispered, over and over. "It's okay now." In that moment, under the dim lights of the harbor, Jae-Hyun realized he wasn't a boss anymore. He wasn't a criminal. He was just a human being who was finally, truly forgiven. The small boat arrived just as the first light of morning touched the horizon. Before stepping on board, Jae-Hyun took one last look at the city of Incheon. He took his expensive gold watch, his phone, and his silver pistol, and placed them into a heavy bag filled with stones. With a deep breath, he dropped the bag into the dark, churning water. To the world of crime and the men who hunted him, Kang Jae-Hyun was gone. He wanted the syndicates to believe the great tiger had drowned at the pier, leaving no trail behind. They traveled far away to a quiet village by the sea, a place where the air smelled of salt and jasmine instead of smoke and exhaust. Jae-Hyun traded his tailored suits for simple sweaters and work boots. He found a small house with a garden where Ha-eun could run without looking over her shoulder. To the neighbors, he was just a quiet man with a scarred face who adored his niece. Nobody knew he was once the most feared man in the country. One sunny afternoon, Jae-Hyun sat on the porch, watching Ha-eun play in the grass. She was no longer wearing the tattered yellow raincoat. Instead, she wore a bright sundress, and her laughter sounded like music. She was teaching her teddy bear how to plant flowers. She looked healthy, happy, and most importantly, safe. Jae-Hyun looked down at his arm. The blue space alien bandage was long gone, replaced by a faint white scar, but he still remembered the moment she had placed it there. He realized that faking his death wasn't an ending, it was a beginning. He had lost his money, his power, and his throne, but he had gained something he never thought he deserved, a family. Ha-eun suddenly looked up and saw him watching her. She picked a small yellow wildflower and ran over to him, tucking it behind his ear. "You're smiling, Ajushi," she chirped, clapping her hands. Jae-Hyun reached out and ruffled her hair. He realized she was right. His heart, which had been frozen for 20 years, was finally warm. He was no longer a ghost haunting the streets of Seoul. He was a guardian. He was a friend. And as he looked at the little girl who had saved his soul with a whisper, he knew he would spend the rest of his life making sure she never had to be afraid again. The boss was dead, but for the first time in his life, Jae-Hyun was finally alive.